This episode of the .NET Core podcast is brought to you in part by RJJ Software. RJJ Software is dedicated to helping you realize your company's digital potential through innovative solutions using the latest technologies. Utilizing the latest in .NET and cloud technologies, we can help you build the solution your business needs on time and under budget. We have world-class experience in cross-platform development using the latest iterations of the Microsoft technology stack. This includes .NET Core, SQL Server, and Azure. Is Azure not your thing? That's fine, because we have experience in AWS, GCP, Linode, and DigitalOcean too. We know what it means to have to be able to iterate quickly and how important DevOps practices are when it comes to remaining agile. As such, we have experts in the major build and release pipelines, from Azure DevOps to AWS, from Netlify to Travis CI, AppVeyor, and everything in between. So get in touch today at rjj-software.co.uk or check the show notes for a link. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, Signal R, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Gaprogman Taylor, and this is episode 43. How do you even start with Josey Howarth? In this episode, Josey Howarth actually interviewed me on how to get started with .NET Core. Some of you may know Josey from her work on the Documentation Not Included podcast as a Gitkraken ambassador, or from her work at her company, Love Sudo. It was quite a lot of fun to be on the other side of the interview, after having been the interviewer for over a year and a half. It was also a lot of fun to be able to go back to basics, as it were, and provide some information on how to actually get started with .NET Core. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So first thing I want to do, Josey, is thank you ever so much for agreeing to be on the show. I know that it means losing a little bit of your evening, and we're all super busy these days, so thank you ever so much for that.
Not a problem. I'm only in the middle of a massive migration. It's okay. It's all right.
It gives you a chance to sort of step away from that, and then maybe we can talk about whatever we're going to talk about, and then you'll come back to it with a fresh pair of eyes, and hopefully you'll go, yes, I see now, rather than the, oh my God, what am I doing? And
normally that would be the case, but I actually have a very well planned out migration, and it's all ready to go. It's just a matter of walking through the steps.
Fantastic.
And it's not code. Well, a little bit is, but it's not like, it's not code. So it's not me sitting there going, why can't I get this function to work?
I always like when everything's really planned out and like you've had the time to think of the what ifs, because invariably your deployment or migration, there'll be a hiccup. It's not that it will go wrong. It's just that something maybe you'll be distracted for a second or two and forget what you're doing. The perfect example I can give is a friend of mine once had a Raspberry Pi set up as a home theater PC, and he didn't do Linux, but he'd asked me to come around and see if I could maybe help him back it up and stuff like that, because he was going to install the update. He was very worried about what happens if the update fails. And we sat there and I said to him, okay, right, here's a USB, plug it into your laptop, we'll live boot into a Linux distro. I'll talk you through the process of backing it up. We took the SD card out of the Raspberry Pi, because you can only access the partitions which have the operating system installed on the SD card through non-Windows, because Windows can't address it. So, okay, we'll plug that in, get that running. And I said, okay, right, we'll do a bunch of the commands to figure out where everything lives, and then we'll craft a command between us in a different window, and I'll sanity check it, and then we'll run it, because if we get it wrong, it'll wipe your computer. So we built the command, and I said, okay, it's sanity checked, but give me a minute, don't run it yet, because I got to nip to the bathroom.
Oh, no.
Came back out of the bathroom, and he'd wiped his computer. Hooray!
You know, in the world of IT, there is this fantastic perception from people who, I guess they could say, they sit there and go, but it's so complicated, or whatever terms they want. I'm not technologically aware. Whatever terms they use, there is this fantastic division, or perception, I should say, of how they see us. And it is this whole thing of, oh my God, you have to come help me. And they never listen to anything you say.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what advice you give, no matter how much you try and lay things out, they never listen.
Yep.
And it's just like, why do you waste my time? I have important things to do. Not really. No, I live the most boring life ever possible. But yeah, I'm actually here for one purpose and one purpose only, Jamie.
Yes.
And that is to bring down the educational level content of your podcast.
That's unfair to say. You're assuming that there's a high level of educational content on this podcast.
Well, I have listened to it, and at times it's complicated, Jamie. It's complicated.
So I guess we've gotten this far into the podcast. I think it might be a good time for the listeners to find out a little bit about who you are and stuff. So I was wondering, could you give the listeners a brief introduction to sort of who you are and what you do and all that kind of stuff?
Certainly. My name is Josey, and I go by quite a few pseudonyms online, including pseudonym as a pseudonym. I also go by Darth Securitas because I am utterly unamused by people's practices when it comes to security. And that is because I am a bit of a fiend, which is why I had a friend nickname me Darth Securitas. I've also been nicknamed a rogue verbal alchemist because I am great at words. Not really, but for some reason someone thought it was funny, so it's kind of dug and stuck. But for me, I have been involved in technology since I ripped apart my mother's stereo when I was like 2.5, trying to find the tiny people in it. And that was a long time ago. We don't ask people who are as old as I am their age because honestly, at this point, I'm older than most people think I am. And it doesn't really matter anymore. But my day-to-day life is literally managed services for websites, web hosting. I do development design. I mainly work in WordPress. I mainly work on Nginx. Yay! PHP, MySQL, Maria sometimes. Is it Maria or is it Mongo? This is what happens when you catch me so late in the day. It's an M base, gosh darn it, and that's what I'm going to stick with. But like, yeah, I basically work in that world now. Now, my history, however, has me involved in things like application development using C# way, way back in the day. I actually was learning C# before it came out properly because they hit the universities. If you're going to get any product out in the market, just so that you know, for those of you who are currently crafting tools, hit the universities. You get the people who are learning a language, a tool set, or anything else with your tool or language or what have you, you've got the market. So a little bit of life lessons for people, just, you know. But I've been around the block a few times. And then I started doing a development podcast called Documentation Not Included for Developers, where we talk about everything from consulting to freelancing to development, which I say with a big sigh, but I love what I do. So, yeah, that's basically me. I am an uninteresting person who is here to grill Jamie about .NET Core.
Well, I mean, it's only fair, isn't it? I've spent, the better part of a year and a bit asking other people questions. So
yes, this is me interviewing you. This is going to be a divergence for those who are listening in the future and in the past. Wait, can that work that way?
Yes.
No, it can't. No, it can't. No, well, it depends on when our, AI overlords come and take us over.
Exactly. The way I explain it on a different podcast that I do called Waffling Tailors is it's the great timecast pod machine wibbly wobbliness.
Exactly. Someone may listen to this in the future and be like, yes, I've heard this before. And I'll be like, that's because half the stuff that comes out of my mouth has been said before. And I'm sorry. For those of you listening, I'm sorry if you get bored. Hopefully you're entertained and hopefully you learn something. If not, you can pick on Jamie.
Yes, it's all my fault. It's always my fault. That's fine.
Excellent.
It's the one thing you learn as a developer is it's always your fault.
Yes. So do I get to ask you questions now, Jamie?
Yeah, I guess if you desperately want to ask me a question, then that's absolutely fine.
Basically, what this comes down to is you and I have had a conversation because we've had you on Documentation Not Included. And Chris, who is my co-host on that show, he loves .NET Core. He loves it. I have never touched it. Like, I've never played with it. I've never really done much with it. I've looked into getting involved in it, but there have always been barriers. But what I want to do is I kind of also want to make certain, and I'm going to play even more dumb than I normally am, but I'm going to play sort of this devil's advocate thing where I'm going to ask you some questions and I might challenge you, but at the same time, I may ask you questions and you just nod along going, so that is how a sycophant answers. But no, I just want to know things. So let me start with the most basic question. Now, you've probably said this before, but I want to know, what to you is .NET Core?
Okay, that's a good one. So .NET Core is the long-winded official answer that requires even more jargon, because that's how it works, right? You need to know words before you can understand other words.
Excellent. So we're going to need a dictionary now?
Yeah, why not? Let's get the dictionary out and let's do this, okay?
All right.
So .NET Core is an open source implementation of the .NET Standard. So let's dial that back a second and figure out what the .NET Standard is. .NET Standard is a standards document which lists a bunch of APIs and methods and all that kind of stuff, object types and classes and things that you can expect a platform which implements the .NET Standard to have. Now, the .NET Standard isn't like a thing that you download. I mean, you can download it, but it's not a thing you download to help you make applications. It is literally a document. And it's kind of like how your language specification works. It's the same sort of thing, except they call it standard rather than specification, which is a bit of a misstep in my opinion. So .NET Core originally started as a subset of .NET Framework. It has now become a completely separate animal because .NET Framework is kind of, how do I put it? I don't want to confuse people like an early episode of the podcast did. .NET Framework is essentially done in bunny quotes, in that it is finished. There's not going to be new features added to it, but there are going to be security updates, and it is going to be supported for the length of the Windows kernel, because the Windows operating system requires .NET Framework to be installed and present for it to work. So it's a very Windows-centric sort of enterprisey thing, and it is required. So if you know anyone with a Windows 10 device, then they have .NET Framework installed.
Well, I could take it even further. If you play video games, you have the .NET Framework installed.
Indeed you do.
I'm sorry, I had to interrupt this because this to me is hysterical, right? I have a non-techie friend of mine who is very much so a gamer and a bit of a paranoid when it comes to technology. So anything happens, it's immediately Josey, I need you to check this and verify this. Is this what it is supposed to be doing? And they went in to do add remove programs to remove something from their PC. And even then I had to hold their hand. And they were scrolling down through the list, and it was just .NET Framework, .NET Framework, .NET Framework, like this huge list of all .NET frameworks. And they were all pretty much the same thing. He's like, why is this happening? I'm like, every time you download a game and install it from Steam, 5, 6, 7 times out of 10, it's going to require the .NET Framework, and it's going to re-download it. It's okay. But yes, sorry, I had to interrupt and interject that.
No, that's fine.
So going back to what I was saying, one of the things that you have made mention of in your explanation is one of the biggest deterrents I have for wanting to get into using just this framework. Well, technically speaking, several other frameworks as well. And it literally comes down to the whole concept of, well, it's slightly complicated. And that's literally what it is. Let me ask you this. Who wrote this .NET Standard? This document?
So the .NET Standard was written by Microsoft.
Right. And originally, back in the day, one of the big problems a lot of people had with that was the fact that it was very closed source.
Yes. But Microsoft is, how do I put it? So I have an analogy that was put to me by a third party. So it wasn't the person who created the analogy. It was the person who heard the person saying it.
Hearsay. Excellent. Bring it.
Hearsay analogy? Is that, can I combine the words together? I don't know. Put a hyphen in there. There we go.
Sure. We'll go with saladed. Hassalogy.
That's it, a hassalogy. Yeah, that's it. If we say it enough times, it'll go into the English dictionary, right?
If it's not already, someone will probably grab it, trademark it, and we'll lose all rights to being able to say it, even though we said it first. But go on.
Exactly. The analogy that I have heard via third party is that one of the sort of leads of the .NET ecosystem over at Microsoft is called Scott Hanselman. And he once said that Microsoft is like an oil tanker. It's slowly turning, if you want to stretch the analogy, slowly turning away from closed source over to open source. But because it's so large, it's going to take time. So over the past 5, 6, 7 years, it's been moving and turning very slowly. So one of the big portions of what people consider is .NET is called MVC, or ASP.NET MVC. Now, ASP.NET MVC is a completely separate thing. It can be added into your... I'll go into what all of these mean in a moment, but the point I'm driving towards is that whilst the .NET framework was entirely closed source, at the time, they developed ASP.NET MVC completely open source, and so you could literally download the source code in C++ and run it on your machine and, you know, compile it and do all this kind of stuff, and it was entirely open source, which started this short, slow amble, I guess, towards open source. Like I said, the beginning of that oil tanker turning, it started that off. But yeah, there is a big history of people, I don't want to say mistrusting Microsoft, because I think that's an unfair term, but a displacement of 100% trust, a lack of trust with Microsoft because it's closed source. And I feel like it's both justified and slightly unfair.
Well, that's the thing, you know, at least for me, I'm a huge fan of open source for a variety of reasons, but there is also serious problems within the open source community as well. So there's never going to be a silver bullet for whether you should be open or closed. It is always going to be situational. I could very easily play the cynic and say that is getting involved in the open source community with the intent to drive what can and what cannot be actually used, or basically figure out a way to eat up every resource possible within the open source community before killing it off. There are people who believe that. But to me, as much as, you know, we can pick any soapbox we want and stand on it, it comes back to one thing, and that is the barrier to entry. I would love to get into understanding my co-host Chris better by being able to speak half of his language, which is .NET Core. Am I able to do that right now? Not easily. Perfect example. In preparation for this show, I decided to look up things like .NET Core versus things like, you know, PHP, whatever. Like just simply .NET Core. When I went to look for information about .NET Core, do you know what came up?
Stack Overflow?
I would love for it to be Stack Overflow. No, what actually came up was ASP.
Oh, ASP. Yeah.
ASP.NET. So it was like, wait, is .NET Core ASP or is ASP.NET Core? Wait, what? Like the barrier to get involved just seems so high to even start finding information. And then when I find blogs, I'm like, oh, there's a little thing here that's trying to explain it. But again, like you started at the start of this show, it's all terms and things that make no sense to me, are not broken down. And I'm like, you know, no, I'll go to one of the beginner things and I'll start looking at that. And I go and I look and it's 5 years old. It's like, come on. All of us can speak from this when we're talking about technology that we're using or things that we're investigating. We know that we have to do our own due diligence. We have to make certain that whatever we're looking at is actually valuable and viable. I can't begin to tell you how many Angular tutorials I ran across that had security flaws in them.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, because of the fact that these things were out and people don't always read and don't always do their due diligence, they just go, oh, there's code here for how to do an Instagram integration into a web app. And they don't actually stop and check. They just copy and paste the things, and it just drives me absolutely bonkers. But there are so many steps in a development cycle, and trying to find the information that is applicable to get started, it just seems like, what's a good analogy, since you are Mr. Analogy Man? A good analogy would be, it's a bit like being a drop of dye being dropped into an ocean.
Okay.
I really would like to reach and color the world with my own opinions, applications, implementation, support, and then education. Because to me, I don't just delve in to learn things. I delve in to learn things to a point where I can teach them. Because when you can teach somebody what you have learned, then that shows, in my opinion, almost a love of what it is that you are talking about or teaching. So I always revert things back to love. Hearts to everybody who's listening. But how? How does one even begin to get started? I know, thanks to you, that Microsoft has now implemented a sort of lesson video introduction thingy on their learning website.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, there's two different types of people who are going to be looking to get involved in this. There's the people who are crossing over from either other frameworks, or they're looking to expand their knowledge. Like, you know, I know somebody in the WordPress world right now who wants to completely leave everything PHP and go into things like Angular and all that other stuff, but they have no clue how to get started in this, .NET Core, anything. And then you have other people who have like almost zero to limited knowledge at all about programming in general. Therefore, you know, they're not going to bring with them the, let's say, habits that another language would say have them bring with them. So it's a little easier, in my opinion, to teach those people if they can find the right resources. But like, how? How and why should I even bother? Let's start with why. Why should I bother with .NET Core? Like, at all?
Okay, so how did I explain it before? I think I said on Twitter, didn't I? Essentially, it's a so .NET Core requires you to use one of two languages which are statically typed, compiled ahead of time languages. They allow you to do things that you can do kind of in the lower languages, C, C++, but without all of the ceremony that's involved with memory management and dealing with individual hex codes and byte arrays and all this kind of stuff.
I'm sorry, you've just completely turned me off from it. If I can't play with it, no, I'm just joking. Continue on. Convince me, Jamie. Convince me.
It's also inherently cross-platform. So .NET Core is, from the ground up, built as a cross-platform application.
You mean it's Java?
Well, this is the thing, right? Okay, so when Microsoft announced .NET Core 1, they had a wonderful image, and it said, one runtime everywhere, or something like that, alluding to you could build it once and run it anywhere, which is what Java promised in the early 90s. And obviously Java, it kind of delivered on that, but it's Java.
Don't get me started on pointers in Java.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that you are actively encouraged not to use the default types for certain things in Java, like the built-in provided ones for things like date times and things, you're actively encouraged not to use them and to use a third party, should tell you almost everything you need to know about Java standard library. But I'm jaded because I'm a C# developer.
Well, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to say Java has its purposes, right? We wouldn't have Minecraft without it.
That's true. We wouldn't have Blu-ray players. We wouldn't have Android as an operating system.
Nope.
Those both require Java. If you've ever written an Android app that hasn't used some kind of cross-compilation tool like Xamarin, which is a .NET thing, or any of the tools that allow you to build a web app and then create an Android binary for it, or if you've ever used a Blu-ray player, they use Java to decrypt, I think, part of the DVD, and they have the interactivity parts are provided by Java as well. So yeah, Java is huge and Java is everywhere.
I'm going to say this, and this will impact future people who are listening, you maybe even more so. The Thursday on our show for documentation not included, I actually have a BYOM, which is a bring your own manual where we teach people things that we have learned or we share knowledge during the show about Java, Java specifically. And I so want to reveal it, but I am holding my breath because I want you to watch or listen to the show, whichever one you want to do. Okay, so let me boil this back. What you're saying is that .NET Core pretty much allows you to build your app. It makes a difference whether you're doing a web app or an actual application itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter what platform it is, as long as they've got the framework installed, which is pretty much a guaranteed download from Microsoft in some way, shape, or form, and in the right framework, therefore it can make use of whatever libraries you make calls on for dependencies. It's a good thing. And that's basically what makes .NET Core so fancy, is the fact that it's basically, for lack of a better term, a container that lets your app run without using containers in the form of Docker or like, I hate our world of IT, but I love it so much. You know, terminologies.
You're running the keyword gambit there. I was expecting you to say machine learning and Bitcoin right about now.
Bitcoin drives me nuts for a variety of reasons, but that's a show for another day. So what you're basically telling me, let's pretend I know bugger all about anything. And that's always a good way to start with me, because yay. You're telling me that whatever I develop where I have the .NET Core as the foundation for my app, it will run anywhere. So I don't have to sit there and go to import, insert, iWords. This particular library, if it runs on this or that or what, like, you can just build it and it will work as long as they've got .NET installed. Is that what you're telling me?
Yes.
If you had said that at the very start, I would have gone, oh, really? But the thing is, this is the problem I have. And it's not just .NET. Like, let's be honest. It's every type of framework out there. It's that, what is the brass tacks of what makes this thing powerful? What am I looking at? Why should I bother with this? And the reality is, it is that platform independence. It is the fact that it is the foundation for an app. Because I can only think of two platforms that do that, .NET and Java. Like, those are just the two that come to my mind. Like, I can't think of anything else that is really that free. I mean, one could jokingly say PHP, but that's a completely different type of thing. Because that's still has its issues depending upon whether you're trying to run it on IIS and Nginx or whatever. But my point is, it's .NET Core and Java, the two big foundational parts of a stack. Would you agree?
Oh, definitely.
So now that I understand really what .NET Core is, because everybody I've asked has come back with all kinds of different fluffy explanations that made no sense to me. But you're one of the first who has done so, so congratulations. The barrier to entry has been lowered.
Hooray!
The next question that I have then is, well, how do I know what the right resources are to learn? I mean, you've got multiple types of learners. You've got the auditorial learners who do best when they hear things. You've got the visual learners who do best when they see things. And you've got what I like to call me, the hands-on learners. And there is a proper term for it, but bugger if I remember what it is.
It's kinesthetic.
Thank you. It's a K word. And that type of learner has to do while also reading and watching. And like, I have to put my hands into it to play. So how would I get started in this? Because this sits at so low on the stack, I don't even know if I want to go Vue or Angular or like any other type of framework on top at all. I just want to know, how would I get started in a way that gives me information that is not completely dated or, you know, this only works on version 2. not version 5.6, which is the latest release thing. Or my favorite one is, when you go to download this, please be aware that the website might have changed and the download version may have changed. You can click on this button to download the version that reflects what we're using in this tutorial. Don't mind the fact that some of the changes that have happened in the last, 6 months since I wrote this tutorial and are showing this tutorial to you have drastically changed everything. Where do I start?
On your final bit there, you hit upon a problem that actually did happen in .NET Core's initial evolution. So when the first version came out, the way that you logically clump a bunch of code together is you create a project file. And the project file says everything within this directory and below it is considered compilable unless it's a type of DLL or a binary or an exe or some kind of blob. So then that way the tools that build everything know where to start to build the app, if that makes sense. Always looks for a program file and always looks for a main entry point, but then it needs to obviously then jump out and go this source file, that source file.
Oh, wow. Main.c.
The reason it has to do that is because .NET Core supports being written in F#, which is a functional language, C#, which is object-oriented, but it also supports...
I am actually familiar with F#. It's not discussed very often, might I add.
It's really not. It should be discussed more because...
There's your next podcast.
Well, there you go. But the compilation tools support those two languages and a language called VB, which is based on BASIC. So it supports all of those. So it needs to know where all of the files are so it can start the compilation process. Problem is that .NET Framework uses a project file which has XML-like syntax. And when .NET Core 1.0 came out, they said, let's change that a little bit and see if we can get away with simplifying it by using JSON. So in .NET Framework land, you have project.csproj, which stands for C# project. And in .NET Core land, in version 1, you have project.json. Taking away the fact that it's XML versus JSON, the formatting and contents of those two files are wildly different.
Yes.
And then they brought out version 1.1, and version 1.1 ditched the project.json and moved everything back to the XML type of project file. Now, the problem with that is everything that's written for 1.1, the code still works, but when they say, make sure you have this line in your project.json, you then have to figure out some kind of arcane wizardry to convert that from the JSON lines into the XML lines. So even in V1, before we even got started, there was this huge sort of issue of, but this works in version 1, but it doesn't work in version 1.1. So there's a lot of complication around that, I guess, in that initial setup. But they've moved completely away from that. And if anyone is still using version 1.0, why? And secondly, there is a command line bunch of arguments you could pass into your build tool that will convert from project.json over to the sort of XML format. Now, it is XML, but it's not horrendous XML like most of the people who implement XML, and it's not the bad implementation of XML, it's a relatively good one. But on your point of how do I get started, I would say you don't even have to install anything. Just go over to try.dot.net.
That's funny because I just tried to get to try dot and it's try.nl, which has absolutely nothing to do with it. I will jump in here and say, you're telling me that I should go to try.net.
Yes.
Or for people in America, try.net.
Yes.
Because .net is just horrible.
Well, it's because it's the try part is a subdomain of .net or .net. You're absolutely right. The URL is horrendous.
It's ridiculous, to quote you.
But when you realize that .net is a Microsoft domain that they own for .net things, because you can't have a period .net, can you? Because that's not going to work, is it?
Exactly.
Because that's a TLD, so you need to have something in front of it.
Anyway, but moving on from URLs and domains and even that, like I could go all over that particular thing. It's another area. So I have tried.net. Wow.
It is a bit silly, but what you'll notice about that page when you load it is it will give you an actual text file and a run button, and you hit the run button and it will run whatever's typed in there. The most interesting part about that, though, is that inside of your browser, you have a full .NET Core runtime running inside of the browser because of a thing that Microsoft have co-opted, I guess, called Blazor. Well, no, it's based on some older work done by a different team. But if you bring up the dev tools inside of your browser,
I'm looking at succeeded, true, diagnostics, null, runner exception, null.
So what you've got there is inside of your browser, you have the DLLs. So these are the libraries that are required to run a .NET environment, but they are being run inside of your browser because of a thing called Blazor, which is built on WebAssembly. In this page, you can take the code that is written out for you. On my screen, it's a Fibonacci stuff. You hit run, and what happens is the code that is inside of your browser will then be compiled inside your browser, then run in a .NET environment inside of your browser. So you don't even have to install anything because it's all there in your browser.
If nothing else, I take away from this episode that .NET Core is powerful because it can run on any operating system and any browser.
Well, exactly.
And that says something because browsers are a pain in every developer's wazoozy. That is my technical term. And yes, you can bleep out wazoozy if you so desire, but it is a pain, an absolute pain, because I work in the world of CSS, like a lot with the stuff that I do. And I get so utterly frustrated when it's like, well, this works on Edge. I'm like, you should be using Edge to begin with, but I understand. I get that it doesn't work on Edge. Oh my God. but it's one of those things. Okay. So the first thing you say is to play around with it and to see what it actually is.
Yeah.
And you can do that with that place, that website, which would be in the show notes because you're a smart man and you'll do that, right? Okay. So if I wanted to build something, or I wanted to then take myself to the next level, like I now have a foundation, but what do I do with it? Like, great, I can have people install .NET every time they, install my app.
So one of the things I'll say is you don't have to install .NET Core to run the app. You should indeed have the .NET Core runtime. You need a runtime, right? But the build tools allow you to do what's called a self-contained build. So you hit build and you get out a bunch of binaries that also include the relevant version of the .NET Core runtime in the same directory. And what happens is when you run the app will go, where's my .NET Core at? It will start by looking where you started it from, and then we'll travel up. So I mentioned traveling down before. So if you imagine, like the file system is a tree, right? With the root of your drive at the very top of the tree, and all the leaves and nodes represent all the directories, right? And when I said before we look down the path, we start in a directory and we look at all the subdirectories. Well, what .NET Core does is when you run an app, it will look in the directory where the app lives for a runtime that it can use. And if it can't find one, it will go up a directory to the parent directory and look there, and then up another level to the parent directory, all the way until it gets to the root of the drive, and then it will go into known places. So it will look in program files, and it will look in your user bin area if you're on a Xnix, I guess. There is, on Windows, there is a defined path for C program files, Microsoft.NET, I think. And on Unixes and Linuxes, I think it's /user/bin/.NET. But because you can run the app anywhere, it has the ability to travel up and down the file system looking for a runtime which matches. But it will use the path first. It will say, I am here. Is there one here? Is there one in the path? Right, okay, travel up.
So question then, what is the footprint size?
What is the footprint size? Okay, so one of the most interesting things, I'll prefix this. I'll give you the answer in a minute. I'm working like a very good politician here.
Yes, you're filibustering. I just want to know what the footprint is, and you're filibustering.
For it will depend on which APIs within the runtime you're using. So if you do a self-contained build, you will get the .NET Core runtime, and if you're doing web stuff, you may get the ASP.NET runtime as well, and all of those libraries. But with that, obviously comes a lot of hardware space. And so you're looking at 120, 130 megabytes to start with. But the .NET Core build tools can now do a thing that is highly experimental called tree shaking. So if you're familiar with Angular or Vue, linting and things like that in JavaScript, what you can do is you can say, I've pulled in this 12 megabyte library, but I'm only using this one API. So recompile this DLL, this library, only with the code that I am using. So if I'm pulling in, there's a big library in .NET called JSON.NET, which helps you to serialize and deserialize into JSON and .NET types, into .NET types and classes. So you can serialize and deserialize very easily. Problem is, that library itself is 20 megabytes. But if you're only deserializing JSON into a known type, you only need 50, 60 kilobytes of library. So what you can do is, if you're only using this one method, it will recompile the entirety of that library with just that one method in. So instantly you can see that particular library becomes 95% smaller. And then because .NET Core is written in .NET Core, the compiler can do that to itself. So the compiler could do that to the runtime. So then what originally was 130 megabytes can then drop down to 50, 60, maybe even 40 megabytes. But the problem is the .NET stuff allows you to use a thing called reflection to load in things at runtime that you didn't explicitly say were there. So if you do this tree shaking in ahead of time compilation, then you use reflection, you then try to call something which isn't there and the whole system blows up. But yeah, you can ship the entirety of the bits of .NET Core that your app needs with your binary. This wasn't available in .NET Framework because .NET Framework is all tightly coupled. The whole thing is very coupled to itself, whereas .NET Core is designed from the ground up to be entirely modular. So you may only require the logging aspect of it, or you may only require the configuration aspect of it. And because of that, you can say, I want just .NET Core and logging, or I want .NET Core and the web stuff and the Xamarin stuff, so the mobile app stuff, and I want configuration and I want this, and it will give you all of those things when you hit compile.
And Mongo! I want to play with Mongo!
Exactly.
Okay. See, that makes sense. Although I have to admit, the whole concept of tree shaking just it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what I've basically gotten so far then is that I need to understand that .NET Core is simply a runtime environment that can run anywhere.
Pretty much. The most important thing to remember about that, though, is so .NET Core can power desktop applications, right?
Yeah.
You can hit compile, and you have the desktop application for Windows. You hit compile again, and you've got it for Linux's. Obviously, I have to say is on the end there, because Linux is the kernel, isn't it? It's not the operating system. You then hit compile again, and you've got Mac OS. You could do all of those things with a single command line switch, so it will develop them all at the same time. You can then go make it for Xamarin, so that makes it for iOS and Android with the flick of a switch. You then go make it for Blazor, so it runs in a web browser with the flick of a switch. A couple of lines of code needed to be added in, but with a flick of a switch, you've got all of those targets. But then you go one step further and you realize that Samsung have released a series of electronic devices, TVs, fridges, smartwatches that run on the Tizen operating system.
I do not want my app to run on my fridge. Just the whole concept of IoT just makes, Darth Securitas is here. Not a good thing.
Oh, of course. Yeah, of course. I mean, it's not going to be secure code at all. But the idea is that because Tizen's official programming environment is .NET Core, you push a button, you can run your app on your fridge. And then you push another button and you've got it on IoT devices that are the small form factor devices, so Raspberry Pi or the Meadow project, which is another device that has a bare bones operating system and .NET on top of it.
Will it run on an Arduino? Oh.
Yes, there is a runtime called NetDuino, which is .NET on the Arduino. So it literally runs anywhere.
Okay. What you should say is, but wait, there's more. Okay.
But wait, there's more. You ever heard of the video game engine Unity?
Let's see. In my years as a game journalist and a gamer, I don't think I've ever run across anything called Assassin's Creed, right? Of course I've heard of Unity. Go on.
That runs .NET too. So you could push a button and essentially import it into a Unity game and have it running on the Nintendo Switch or the PlayStation or the Xbox or a PC running Windows or anything that Unity targets. So yeah, it really does run anywhere.
You know, I know we're coming to the close of the episode, and I've basically come in as resistant as I possibly can be to .NET Core.
Yes.
Like I said, the barrier to entry is way too high, and trying to find good quality resources to learn on the go is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we haven't even touched really on too much beyond that. I mean, basically this show is complaints with and then, but wait, there's more. But, you know, you have actually convinced me to put the time in to find the resources. And that's how limited our time is in today's day and age, whether it's the companies we run, the clients we work for, the companies we work for, family, entertainment, and all the other things that go with it. You've actually convinced me to put time aside to dig into this and find the proper resources to learn this. And that's saying something. Now, whether or not this progresses beyond just an initial interesting, I kind of get it now. We'll see. Because for me, and I'm sure this is the same for a lot of people, when learning something, I need to have a project. I can't just go, okay, I press in a button and yay, I can do the Towers of Hanoi. Yay, bubble sorting. Don't even get me started on sorting algorithms. Oh my God. But that means nothing to me. To me, it's the practical application of things that matters. Now, I have several projects sitting around, part done in quite a few different languages because time, lack of drive, be realistic, laziness, you know, those kinds of things. But there has to be a spark that keeps me going. And I think what might keep me going on this, and we'll have to do like a check-in in the future if people care to have me back, or if they're bored with me, they can let me know. But if in the future we do a check-in again, and it can be, well, what did you do with this information? Did you actually study it, learn it, or are you a proper convert? I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But the fact is, I now actually want to put time aside. It's not just, that'd be a kind of cool thing to do when I, you know, have a moment. It's now, where can I fit this learning process in? And that is a bigger step than I think anyone could have gotten. I mean, Chris, I love my co-host, but my goodness, he has like .NET Core is his thing. It's his baby. And he's tried to explain it to me, and I probably didn't ask the right questions because when he and I talk, and we talk dev and other things, we're all over the place because he's enterprise. Mm-hmm. I'm not, right? So there is like this slightly different mindset between the two of us, which works great for the show, but not necessarily for the sit-down educational learning process. But you've literally convinced me with this show to learn. But now you do realize that I'm going to be on your case when I'm like, well, what are my resources here?
Okay. Well, how about I give you a bunch of resources now then?
Why, yes. I don't think that would hurt at all. It's not like others listening could not make use of this. This was not planned. It really wasn't, actually.
Okay.
But I also expect these to be in the show notes so that, you know, 2 weeks from now or a month from now, when I finally get a chance to sit down and do something, those resources better still be usable, better still be good, and better not make me download version 2 or 1.0. Don't make me use JSON. But anyway, go ahead.
Don't worry about that. They've officially abandoned everything to do with that project.json thing. It was a nice experiment, but it didn't really go anywhere, and it got too complicated because then the build tools, there's a tool called MS Build, which is what is used to sort of bootstrap the building process. MS Build got inherently stupidly complex because it had to support both the XML and the JSON build project types.
Bloat comes from bad decisions.
And then obviously when they said, right, .NET Core 1.0 is no longer supported, they were able to wipe that out of the MS Build tools, which is wonderful. I think it's the one time that Microsoft haven't been, we need to be 100% backwards compatible, because I think that they realized it was, I don't want to say a mistake, just maybe a poorly timed decision. Because they're trying to get as many people to move across and the tools didn't work or whatever.
You know what? This is going to sound so kind of crazy weird, but at the same time, it shows the tangential track my mind takes. But I wonder if this is why so many games for Xbox are starting to be backwards compatible. This whole, in the gaming industry with consoles, it's all about like, oh no, the PlayStation 5 is coming. Does that mean that anything from PlayStation 4 is backwards compatible or not? Like all of the the gaming issues. But Microsoft seems to be a lot further ahead along the trend, and I'm wondering if it's because of .NET Core.
It could be, but part of that is also you have to look at the way that Microsoft have always produced their operating systems. So Windows inherently, even though, let's pretend, I don't know whether you are, but let's pretend that you're running Windows 10. I don't know whether you are. I'm definitely not. I'm running Pop! OS 1910. But let's say you're running Windows 10. Your Windows 10 machine, you have to futz with it a little bit, but can run all binaries all the way back to Windows 3.1.
Sort of.
Yeah, I'm not saying that you should, and there's a lot of futzing required to do it, but on top of that, so for instance, Creative Suite 2, we talked a little bit about Creative Suite off air, right? Creative Suite version 2 required a number of hacks to get it working on early versions of Windows.
Or Mac.
They needed to be present in the Windows kernel. They are still present in the Windows kernel. So you could still run Creative Suite 2 as it was first released, the vanilla version of it, on your Windows 10 machine, because those hacks are still present in the kernel and they need to be sort of transported across for every subsequent release of the Windows kernel. So what I'm getting at is that Windows is so backwards compatible because it is entrenched in that enterprise arena. I mean, you'll know yourself, Josey, when a company comes to you and says, we need to upgrade our fleet of computer hardware, but we need to make sure the applications still work.
Yeah. But see, this is why in the world of web development, you know, containerization is a thing. And we now have things like AWS and other cloud-based things, yada, yada, yada. So these resources, perhaps we should let the viewers hear them, not just me.
Yes, indeed. So I would go with, first one is learn.microsoft.com. In the past 6 months to a year, Microsoft have been very, very active in recreating a number of their learning tools. Before then, it was academy.microsoft.com, and there was a bit of a sort of
MSDNAA.
Yeah, pretty much. And it became kind of gamified. So you would pass a course and you'd get a certificate, or you'd get 50 points or whatever. And it didn't mean anything. But the idea was obviously to get you to do more of these courses, I guess, than your friends or your colleagues or whatever. But learn.microsoft.com is a complete rebuild of the entire system. And it actually has tracks that you can follow for .NET Core. So you are a complete noob, and people like Scott Hanselman and Kendra Havens, a number of prominent Microsoft educators and outspoken prominent Microsoft people take you through going from I know nothing about .NET to I have a website up and running. Some of the videos are very much a case of let's go all the way back to basics and say, you know, this is a source file and this is a namespace. And some of them jump straight in at the deep end with, you have your website up and running and we're going to add middleware and a bunch of things to do stuff. So there's the progression is what I'm saying. It doesn't just go, part 1, you know nothing. Part 2, draw the rest of the owl. It's very much a case of learn this, learn this, learn this. Some of them are a bit slow, but they are designed for everyone to sort of follow along, and they are supported by Microsoft. With that, there is docs.microsoft.com, so docs.microsoft.com.
That's been there forever.
Ah, yes, but this has been rebuilt completely. So this is completely open source documentation. If you spot an issue with their documentation, there's a link on every single page for the GitHub version of that documentation. You then submit a pull request and your change is live on docs.microsoft.com within 15 minutes. So the documentation is always up to date now. On each page, there's a drop down for which version of .NET Core you're playing with. It will always assume the V latest that is in long-term support, but it lists all of them. So if you go to one of the pages now, I think it should say .NET Core 3, and then there's a drop down, it'll say .NET Core 3, .NET Core 2.2, .NET Core 2.0, .NET Core 1, although it's not really supported anymore. So you can say, I'm actually supporting an old app that runs .NET Core 2.1, which is still long-term support, even though .NET Core 3 is out. And you can say, I have this project which is running this, and I need to know how to do this. So that's always really useful. You can always read the docs. Another really useful thing, but only once you've started playing around with .NET Core, and if you have a background in .NET Framework or .NET Classic or .NET Full Fat, as I call it, is APIs of .NET, which allows you to search for a type, an API or a class or a namespace, and it will tell you which versions of .NET support that. So it will say .NET Framework supports it from 4.2, .NET Core supports it from 2.0, Mono supports it from this particular build number, Xamarin, and Unity, and all of these. It will list which versions of what things support that API. And it will also list if, for instance, it only has partial support. It will say, this class is implemented, but these two APIs aren't, so you can't use everything. And so that helps you if you're migrating a framework app to Core or a framework app to Mono, or you're messing about and chopping and changing between the two, or between the three, to Mono, to Xamarin, to all of these different platforms. You can see which versions of what support which APIs. That's a really, really horrendous way of saying it, but I think you get what I mean.
I get what you mean. I hope everyone listening does. If not, you can totally blame him.
That's right. It's definitely all my fault. That's not a problem. So I would go with those two. There are a number of Pluralsight courses. If you have Pluralsight, I do have it, but I've forgotten the names of some of the people. I can always put some links in the show notes, but that's a paid service. So that's something that you would have to obviously go out and pay for.
Pluralsight is, I mean, honestly, if you are interested in your own education in the IT world, Pluralsight is the best investment you can make in yourself. So even if your company doesn't cover you, and no, this isn't sponsored, but damn it, we should be. Well, everyone should. Well, I say we because I'm thinking of, documentation not included, but you should be too. Just saying.
There's also an incredibly short, I don't want to put people off by saying it's short because it's very feature rich. There's a book called .NET Core in Action, and that was written by one of the first guests on this show called Dustin Metzger, and that essentially takes you from I have no idea what .NET is to I have some idea of what .NET is. That's available via Manning Publishing, so there's a cost involved in that too, but that's a really good book, and it goes from no idea to some idea along the route of let's load a debugger and things.
The thing that turns me off from books, and this is not to say I'm not going to look at getting this book or anything else like that, it's more the thing that tends to turn me off with books is, oh wow, this is going to make me feel so old. I recently found a book for PHP that it's old. I think it was published before I was born. And as I said at the start of the show, I'm pretty old. So information gets outdated so damn quickly. So will this become outdated?
So the book itself was released in, I think, 2017?
2018? It's okay. Time travel-y, wibbly wobbly stuff.
Exactly. So the author was part of the .NET Core team. So at the time, things were in flux, but a lot of what's in the book is still applicable to the .NET Core system today. I would say learn.microsoft.com and docs.microsoft.com first. And then for more of a sort of theoretical grounding, if you really want to get into the nuts and bolts, .NET Core in Action. It does go through at a certain pace, a certain velocity, because the Manning in Action series is all about going from no knowledge to I have something that is built. So it does sort of make a number of small leaps, but it explains those leaps after you've leapt them. Is that correct? I don't know.
I get what you're saying. Out of curiosity, why that particular, the guy on the cover?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure why Manning choose to. All of their books have
historical figures.
Yes, I mean it's like the O'Reilly books. The O'Reilly books all have animals, and it's like, well, what does an owl have to do with Node.js? It's explained in the publisher notes or whatever. It's an interesting story as to what the image is. They don't explain why. I think they literally just go, we haven't used this image yet.
Okay, I was just curious. All right, cool. So those multiple resources, and anything else you want to throw out there?
I mean, this podcast. I mean, it is primarily an interview show, but the first few episodes are what is .NET Core, what is Mono, what is .NET Standard. So there's a little bit of a theoretical grounding there for if you want that sort of detail. But I also have a number of streams that are available. They were originally done on Mixer, but then I edited them and throw them up onto YouTube. And I think you can go to youtube.com/c/ I think it's jamietaylor.net or something. I can't remember the URL, but I'll put it into the show notes. And as soon as I figure it out, I'll send it to you, Josey. Either that or you can go /channel and then a bunch of characters. I don't know what it is. But yeah, on that page, there are a number of videos. Some of them are episodes of the show because there are people who legitimately like to consume podcasts via YouTube. So I let them do that.
Yep.
But in there is a playlist of live streams. One of them, I believe, is me going through I have no code all the way up to I have a built application in about 2 hours. You talked about implementing certain algorithms. Well, I implemented FizzBuzz entirely in .NET Core using TDD.
You know what? I'm going to actually have to go look at your FizzBuzz because it can say so much about someone.
Fair enough.
And I am going to peer over your shoulders into your choices for how you implement that particular algorithm so that I can then, narrow my eyes at you and be like, oh, you're one of those. Get to be a really good manager who got their MBA in business management instead of programming and development or working their way up the stacks and going, you're not doing it right. You don't even know what I'm doing. Go away. Wait, let me use all the buzzwords and put all of our ducks in a row and, have all of the hymn sheets in the same book or something.
Have you ever seen the Enterprise FizzBuzz?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I'll put it in the show notes. It's FizzBuzz written in Java, but for the enterprise. So everything is dependency injected. There are tests that mock the entirety of the framework and all that kind of stuff. It is ridiculous.
I have to say, if a framework cannot take being mocked, they shouldn't exist. Because the people who end up mocking frameworks the most, regardless of what type of framework it is, are usually the people who love it.
I agree completely. I agree. That's an exercise for the listener and an exercise for you for later on. It's got nothing to do with .NET Core, but it is fantastic to read.
Oh, excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much. I leave with homework.
Thank you ever so much for being on the show anyway. Even though we had some technology problems, it was a blast talking to you. One of the things that I always round these off with is tell us a little bit more about how we can get in contact with you and all of the projects you're interested in and the things that you're doing. You mentioned documentation not included. Tell me all about it.
Well, documentation not included is the podcast that I run on a weekly basis, which is actually also a vodcast because unlike, smart people who pre-record, who can then edit and cut things. We do it live. We live on the cutting edge of our discussions. But no, documentation not included is all about development and not just development. It's all flavors, etc. And including because Chris, my co-host, and I, we run our own companies. And for some, they're contractors. For us, we're companies that get hired for our services. In my case, managed services along with some virtual assistants. Whereas Chris actually does enterprise type solutions and other things that go with it. You can learn a lot about him by just going to dnistream.live. And it is there that you will find all kinds of ways to link to us. Other than that, I have to bring this up only because I am an incredibly proud ambassador for GitKraken, which is a visual Git client. So I try to bring them up where I can. I don't bring it up on DNI because we have a certain philosophy where, we try not to push technologies, but it's not my show. So I get to push. Yes, I'm an ambassador for GitKraken, and I highly recommend it. And for people who may listen to this for the why should you learn something or how do you even get started is really a good title for this episode. How do you even start? I highly recommend also getting involved in the visual side of things with Git Kraken for Git, because, oh my gosh, if you ever wanted to really see how it all links together in a very pretty interface, then you definitely want Git Kraken. Plus, I mean, come on, their mascot is Keef. Keef is this adorable, like, octopus type Kraken monster thing. And I absolutely love Keef. And they designed a Keef version for Ada Lovelace, actually, on my recommendation, which I hold very near and dear to my heart. One of the first female programmers. But yeah, other than that, the things that I find interesting in life are reading. Reading and development and just learning. Actually, the biggest thing I want to say, if anyone actually listens this far, reach out to me on my Twitter at JoseyHowarth and just say hi. I want to meet more and more people. It is hard for me to leave the house right now. So having my developer community online, it's one of the things that fascinates me about technology. I mean, our voices are ones and zeros right now, and yet there's more to it than that. You get tone, inflection, volume. Like, it's crazy. I'm not going to go Brian Blessed. But yeah, just reach out to me, say hi, and let me know that you've heard something. And if you've got a bit of advice or suggestions in the .NET Core world, send them my way. I would like to know. But I'm going to open source my learning process, as the case may be.
I like it.
I will stress one of the big things that I want people, if you are listening and you actually care to get involved and say this, send me things about the security side of things for it. How do you make certain it's properly secure? How do you do all of the things that go with it? Because in the end, if I run across something and I see that, there's no real proper fix for it other than hacks, as the case may be, I'll cry a little bit. And it might actually turn me off from it. So send me security things. I want to know the security side of things too.
That's interesting because I have actually created, so in .NET we create packages that are called NuGet packages. Mm-hmm. I don't know the etymology as to why it's NuGet, but it's essentially a zip file with all of the code you can add as a library, a dependency for your app. And I have created an HTTP middleware that injects the OWASP recommended security headers and values into the response that your application will generate when it receives a request, if that makes sense. There's a really complicated way of explaining what it is. But yeah, so it would be interesting to see what you think about that. It's all just strings at the end of the day, but yeah.
Yeah.
So just real quick then, when does DNI Stream Live go out? Because you mentioned it was a vodcast and it's live and stuff, but when does it go out?
Well, it is Thursdays UK time, 7 p.m. on twitch.tv/DNI Stream. I didn't include it because all our links are on our website, dnistream.live. We're on things where we're just like, oh, we exist out there. Oh, we're out there too. We're everywhere. You can listen to us. You can make fun of us. And hell, if you want to be on our show, get in touch. We talk about absolutely anything and everything. We're not platform dependent. We are the .NET Core of podcasts for developers.
I like it.
Did I make it relevant?
Yeah, that was
awesome.
And obviously I was on an episode as well, but I wasn't talking about .NET in the slightest, was I?
No, we weren't. We were talking about static site generators and frameworks and stuff. Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you so much for being willing to face the firing squad of one who just is literally looked into it and then got fed up with it and then just said, bleh.
I think everyone needs that kind of person around, though. The person that will look into it and give up and then go to someone and go on then, why should I? What's so great about it?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Josey, for spending some time with us and talking to me and getting me to answer questions. It was a nice little revolving chairs. My analogy part of my brain is...
Role reversal?
That's what I was trying to think of. The analogy part of my brain is all broken now.
I'm sorry, listeners. I broke Jamie.
That's right. I've got a null reference exception happening. That's what it is. Segmentation fault.
Hey, that is something I could put on my CV. I broke Jamie from .NET Core.
Thank you ever so much, Josey. I really appreciate it. It's like I say, it's the evening. We all need time to chill out in the evenings. We've gone over our allotted time by almost a whole hour because of a few technical issues. But, we got there in the end, and I've answered a few questions. And maybe we could check in with you in a couple of months, maybe in 6 months, maybe in a year, see if you've built anything.
You know what? I think that would be good, because one of the cool things is if you have someone that you are held accountable to. That's what mentors can be really, really good for. So, yeah, hold me in .NET Core accountability.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much again.
You're very welcome. Thank you ever so much for agreeing to spend the time to talk to me for a little while. That was my interview with Josey Howarth. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.